So as in all the previous cases, our moderator will introduce our panelists and get things started. But let me just say thank you, Paula, for doing us the honors of moderating this panel, for working with us at the Mexico Institute for a number of years now on several projects. Paula is with the San Diego Regional Chamber, where she manages all the international affairs, the binational projects that they do, and should just recognize her and the San Diego Regional Chamber for their outstanding work to represent the U.S. Mexico border region in Washington and to do work locally in your community. So with that, let me pass it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. All right, the last panel of the day, so we know we have everybody's attention, right? Thank you for being here, and for our panelists, whom I will introduce here briefly. Just to kind of wrap up the discussions that we've had, we've heard from elected officials on the need to collaborate on policy with their counterparts in different levels of government. We've talked about what those policies are and the infrastructure that we need to build to facilitate trade, and how we build that on a binational basis. So what does all of this collaboration at these different levels turn into? Let's take a magnifying glass into our region at the border, where we can see a perfect example of the level of collaboration and what that translates into in terms of economic development. We know that economic development surely impacts the entire country, both countries, throughout the country. But what does it look like at our border region, which is which is a very complex and thriving economy because of the different policies, infrastructure, and work that has been done, as well as challenges that we have ahead of us. We have here Melissa Floca she's the interim director of the University of San Diego's Center for U.S. Mexican Studies, a longtime friend and partner for the San Diego Chamber and our region throughout. And Gabriel Gonzalez, he is a professor of economics at Mexico's Colegio de la Frontera, COLEF. And if we, in keeping in theme with the discussion today of collaboration, these two have been collaborating on the research and studies, not just for this, but Gabriel actually used to be a fellow at the Center for Mexican Studies, so the relationship continues. It's a perfect example of that collaboration, not just from elected or appointed officials, but from the academic perspective. And then we have Barrett Haga, who's the Senior Administrator for Economic Engagement, where he's responsible for Economic Development Administration's international engagement portfolio and other projects related to the interconnectivity and advancement of the new economy. Thank you. And Carlos Marin, Principal in Charge for Ambiotech Group. Dr. Marin is also a member of Unite Brownsville, which is the other bookend of our border, Brownsville, Matamoros on one end, and San Diego, Tijuana, which is, I think, really interesting to observe the different border regions. So I'm excited to have this conversation and learn about what the economic opportunities that have been provided here. Why don't we go ahead and start with Melissa and Gabriel with your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paula. Can you guys hear me in the back of the room? Yes. So back in 2014, for the 20th anniversary of NAFTA, the Center for U.S. Mexican Studies launched a binational research collaboration to author a publication on the comparative advantage of cross-border industries in Cali Baja. And Cali Baja is the part of the world that we include with the County of San Diego, the County of Imperial, and then all of the state of Baja California. That collaboration included a technical committee with researchers from UC San Diego, from El Colegio de la Frontera Norte, Gabriel Noé Fuentes, here with us today as well, the San Diego Regional EDC, the Cali Baja Binational Mega Region, and the San Diego Association of Governments, as well as a large advisory committee from both the public and private sector on both sides of the border. And this study told us largely what we already knew in our community, that advanced manufacturing industries like semiconductors, aerospace, AV equipment, medical devices, that those were all at the core of our binational economy. So as a next step, we decided amongst our research team that we wanted to understand exactly how supply chains in the region worked. We wanted to know at the industry level how we have cross-border production that creates jobs, that creates value, and that creates exports for the region. And then we did what academics do best, and we set off on years of painstaking and painfully boring conversations about customs data, standard deviations, multipliers. You can all be glad that you weren't there. I was there, I can tell you. And we created what's called an input-output model of the cross-border supply chains for 218 industries in Cali Baja. And kind of understandably, it was something that no one had ever done before, but not that many people were very interested in either, until the 2016 US presidential elections. And, okay, well, after the elections, I started to get the same question, bombarded by emails. How important is trade? Does Cali Baja need trade? What will trade or the lack of trade do to our economy? Can you tell me how many jobs we will lose? Can you tell me what will happen to our GDP if the rules of trade change? And it turns out that that's not a question that economists can really answer. And so we said, maybe our model that we built can help answer that question, because data on imports and exports is really just a long tally of every time something gets sold or purchased going back and forth across the border. It doesn't have any direct connection to numbers like GDP or numbers like jobs. It's a whole different system of accounting. But what our model does do is tell us how those sales and purchases create value, and then how that value turns into wages and GDP and value for the region. So it's not about trade deficits at all. And I'm going to show you just a couple of slides from our model, which is interactive, and it'll be online in the next couple of weeks, where you can go and you can see how different supply chains in the region work. It's probably not worth going into here, but this is the cross-border supply chain in our region. You can see lots of different industries, lots of connections from one industry to another. This is just manufacturing, so it's the things that manufacturing companies buy and sell and who they buy and sell them to. You can drill down in the model. You can look at particular manufacturing industries. You can look at them buying. This is selling. This is buying. And then you can look with lots of granularity at all of the connections that happen between our industries going back and forth across the border in the region. And so I'll let Gabrielle tell you a little bit about the kinds of things that the model tells us.
Oh, thank you. So basically what we have is that in the region, $6.2 billion are interchanged between Baja California and San Diego and Imperial Valley, just in intermediate goods. So these are goods that are bought to produce something else, or to continue producing the same thing. From this $6.2 billion, 2.5 or 4, about 40% of them are in more advanced manufacturing. So we have a lot of trade in stuff like food, textile, wood, paper, plastic, petrochemicals, but we also have almost, 40% in metal products, machinery, computers, electronics, transportation equipment, electrical equipment, furniture, and medical devices. So, okay. So, if we look only at the North American Industry Classification Code 33, which this is a sector which has companies like Kyocera and Samsung and Becton Dickinson. If we look only at this part of the economy, we have that $1 billion go from San Diego to Baja, and $1.5 billion go from Baja to San Diego, which means that the U.S. has a $500 million deficit. And, well, given the current political landscape, this is a data point that says, "Oh, why is the U.S. doing this?" So I would like to say that this is not a very important number. It's not meaningless, but it's not a very important number. It's much more important the value that these exchanges create. Okay, so basically, what we found in the model is that for every dollar of inputs that San Diego imports, either from the rest of the U.S. or from abroad, including Baja, an extra 84 cents are produced in value, are produced in wages, in capital gains. So that's pretty good for San Diego. Well, for San Diego and Imperial Valley. So basically, this industry has 10 billion total value added per year. And of this 10 billion value added, you get about 65,000 jobs, and about $100 million go each week to in form of wages to workers. So this is a good deal for San Diego, and this is a sector that it's about 8% of San Diego's and Imperial Valley's GDP. Of course, Baja gains also from this relationship. These manufacturing companies generate about $4 billion in value added, and it's 16% of Baja's GDP. Okay, so at its core, this project is a binational project. It's a binational effort, and we want to disentangle the impact of cross-border trade in the Cali-Baja region. And because we don't have offhand the statistics to disentangle all these relationships, we made this model. However, less than 5% of all the U.S. Mexico trade takes place in this region. So what we want to do in the future is to look at all the relationships in the rest of the border, basically. So that's our next plan.
Thank you very much. Carlos, what similarities or differences? I'm very curious and to hear your presentation as well and your
Sure.
comments. Being on the bookend side of economic development opportunities, you have very different characteristics as well.
Correct.
So
Correct.
there's all sorts of different factors we can't compare.
Correct.
They're not apples to apples.
Right.
What economic development opportunities do you
Well,
have?
we are currently completing a study that is focused on the backward integration of manufacturing supply chains in the Brownsville-Matamoros region. Brownsville, for those few of you that may not know where it is located in the southmost point of Texas, along the Mexican border. It is largely characterized as a pass-through public sector-driven economy, and is forecast to have, which is surprising, amongst the fastest growth rates in population in the entire state of Texas over the next 50 years. Matamoros, on the other hand, depends mostly on the manufacturing sector, which in turn drives warehousing and logistics activities on the U.S. side. Matamoros Maquila's relative numbers produce about $8 billion worth of total output. But about 80% of that output comes from products, intermediate products from the outside. So the real value added is only 20%, or around $1.6 billion. So the purpose of our study was a little more focused. It wasn't just looking at the entire economy and all the flows, but looking at the possibility to identify potential strategies for manufacturing locally, either on the U.S. or on the Mexican side, a portion of that 80% of the products that are being imported from somewhere else, in order to look at ways to improve the local economy. The study was divided into 5 steps. First, let's identify the inputs to the region, including their type, volume, and their value. Number 2, identify what it takes to manufacture them, so the processes and technologies that are required to manufacture those inputs. Third, determine how much actual availability is locally of those technologies and processes, and then identify the regional gaps and opportunities, and finally develop strategies for how we can possibly look at what would be needed in order to produce that locally. So let me, and we don't have a lot of time, so let me go straight to our draft findings and recommendations. And I say draft because the document's not out officially, and so we haven't gotten approved by a funding agency. So first, we did find that there are opportunities for producing a portion of those inputs locally. The opportunities fall primarily in the stamping and molding of various automotive and electronic components, as well as the design and production of the dies and the tools. But looking to the future, I think there's consensus amongst a group of us in the local area that there are bigger opportunities for South Texas and the Tamaulipas region than in addition or simply in backward substitution of current supply chains. As evidence mounts for the increasing momentum for reshoring and nearshoring of manufacturing back to North America, especially in the interior of Mexico, we've seen just tremendous activity in manufacturing in Mexico recently. And as the pressures for nationalist economic policies are building in the United States, there's a real opportunity for the border to try to capture some of the advanced manufacturing locally. Some of those opportunities that will emerge. And that is precisely because the border, and as we have seen in the case of San Diego and Tijuana, can bring together the best of the U.S. and the best of Mexico under one roof, in the best geographic location to meet the North America's mass customization consumer demands. But with those opportunities also come challenges, and I think our challenges are very unique to each region. In our case, I think we're associated with a lack of coordination, regional coordination, collaboration, competitiveness, as well as insecurity. Towards that end, our recommendations are as follows. First, we would like to expand the definition that we use for our region of what constitutes competitiveness, beyond simply low waiting times, low transaction costs at ports of entry. While that definition of competitiveness is a necessary condition for global competitiveness, it is not really sufficient to increase the wealth of the South Texas and Northeast Tamaulipas region. nor the important relationship that we see between a prosperous border and a secure one. Instead, we're proposing to expand that vision from simply an efficient pass-through for goods and services for the border to an integrated and essential element of the value-added manufacturing in North America. To that end, we're proposing to expand the definition of regional competitiveness for South Texas is to include 5 elements, additional elements. 1 is talent, 2 is technology, capital, infrastructure, and leadership. Again, those are specific to our area, may not be applicable to other areas. And we are specifically recommending the development of a single integrated binational economic development strategy for our region that addresses specifically each of those elements. In terms of talent, we are proposing a single regional workforce development strategy focused on advanced manufacturing, a strategy that is integrated across the entire binational region from Matamoros to Reynosa, to McAllen to Brownsville, and from high school to community college, to university and postgraduate training and apprenticeship programs. In terms of technology, we are proposing a university-based R&D network to support advanced manufacturing, innovation, and entrepreneurship in the region. With respect to capital, we are proposing to expand incentives beyond traditional job creation and tax deferments to also include credit enhancements, angel investor networks, as well as a program we're proposing, trusted investor programs. I can get into details later. Additionally, we're proposing extending existing pilot pre-inspection programs, you've heard a lot about them today, to facilitate the establishment of international free trade zones for manufacturing facilities co-located across the border at secure border entry points. Finally, in terms of leadership, we're proposing creating a regional public binational border to coordinate the implementation of the overall integrated economic development plan for the region. We believe that a prosperous border is an essential element for securing our border in a cost-effective manner. And we look forward to working with the #OneBorder group to develop and move forward with one voice, one agenda that looks at the border not simply as an efficient pass-through, but rather a fully integrated and strategic element for creating prosperity and security for both nations. Thanks.
Thank you, Carlos. And just to expand a little bit on the mention of One Border, because we hadn't really mentioned that before, but it's a group that we work together to create with the Wilson Center, just bringing the private sector together and the academia world along the U.S. Mexico border from both sides to identify challenges that in common, assets in common, and to develop a strategic vision and implement that on advocacy to advance the work that we have. And it changes from the first time that we met till recently after the election, very focused on just a general promotion of the U.S.-Mexico border, U.S.-Mexico relationship. So that is something, we've heard Ambassador Gutierrez mentioned the need for that private sector collaboration and coordination, and so that is occurring in many different ways, but certainly with all the stakeholders that are here today. So thank you. And I want to hear more in a little bit, because I think it's really interesting to see some of the key ingredients that you mentioned that are necessary for economic development that may not exist in another region. Is that because they're already present in the other region? And how did that happen? Was it an organic development, or was it something that the government perhaps helped to facilitate? And do they need to occur in a certain order? Does something have to come before the other? So moving over to government, what role does the government play in facilitating this? How can it help the private sector and the regions develop in particular? But if you could share some of your thoughts, Barrett.
Right. Well, you have me hungry now. We're talking about food and ingredients, so I'm going to kind of craft in that lens.
You just had lunch, though.
And
did you miss lunch?
Well, I've heard about ingredients and food, and so I'm going to kind of craft this in a statement of sports and food, the two things I know best. Let me point this out with one simple quote. Government does not create jobs. Mm-hmm. Government's there to help create the conditions for the private sector to create jobs. We're there to facilitate the ecosystem, whether it's building it one way or another, whether it's roads, infrastructure, ingredients. And so when you talk about economic development for a second, let me step back and talk about what economic development really is. Economic development is just not building stuff. It's building the capacities for those things to expand or grow or attract new ways of thinking. And so when you look at the border in particular, economic development borders are not defined by necessarily a wall or a bridge or something else. They can go across the border. They're self-morphing, they're self-forming into this entity that's there to optimize the capacities within that area. Brownsville-Montemoros is a good example. Cali Baja, another example. Toronto-Niagara corridor is not defined by a giant waterfall. So when we're looking at these, how do we build these groups to get them to write together? It's really building a better cupcake. There you go. Food here.
I was waiting for that.
There you go. We got to look at, in an era of resource scarcity, tight budgets, we have to find a way to cook with better ingredients. We have to find a way to make the best thing about, actually, what's the best part of a cupcake?
Eating it.
Well, other than eating it, it's the frosting, right? Everybody say it's the frosting, right? Because everybody's basically got the same base of a cupcake, one way, shape, or form. It's a form of sugar, flour, water. It's a simple of roads, infrastructure, talent, workforce. But it's getting those together in the right way to make that beautiful cupcake, but it's building it together through a thing called a comprehensive economic development strategy, or the linkages of all these different ingredients onto one beautiful cupcake. Man, I'm really hungry now. To cook better with better ingredients. Now, how do you pick ingredients? I think Google said it best when they say we need to cook better with better ingredients. When you ask Google, what makes Google Google? They said one simple thing. They said high margins, high flavor, high talent, high revenue. So when you pick those ingredients, you're looking for what we have to pick is what's going to get the optimal revenue back into the community that we're able to fund other things. So when you look at, if we build this cupcake, let's bring it together. It's got great flavor, but it allows us enough revenue streams to fund other components in that ecosystem to grow those and grow those. So now you have more flavors of cupcakes. It's great. So how do you pick that? First of all, we have to understand the data. And one of the things that the U.S. government's providing is we helped fund the Harvard cluster map to understand what data exists across the U.S. It's clustermapping.us. And last year, Mexico launched their cluster map that's compatible with ours. So now we know what ingredients they have, what ingredients we have, to say, you know, maybe we should link up this sector with this sector with this sector to form a better ecosystem. Where do you want to trade? Okay, we know where the supply chain exists. We know that vice versa. I am pleased to say that Canada is now find money in their budget to launch a cluster map, which will launch in 3 months. That's compatible with the U.S. and Mexico's cluster map. European Union, Argentina are all looking at launching compatible cluster maps with the U.S. model. So now we can say what type of ingredients we have. Now, when you bring this together, you've got to find this recipe, and it's called the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy that the U.S. model uses. A 5-year plan, mitigates politics, looks at what to fund, how to fund it, who's coming together with what. Mexico is now, on the border, communities are saying that we want to adopt the U.S. model for the economic development strategy. Mexico is now funding pilot programs across the border to form compatible comprehensive economic development strategies across the border. The first one is actually Arizona-Sonoma, and it can be combined at the end of this year. The goal is next year is combine them into a mega regional plan. So you guys know what ingredients both sides have, how do we bring it together, where to trade, where our connection points are, because borders don't define economic development regions. So going beyond that, Argentina now is adopting our SEDS model. India is adopting our SEDS model of how to look at things. Because wouldn't it be great to say, hey, you've got these specific clusters here, let's link those up over there. So I'll end with a quick story of how this is working. Conover, North Carolina makes a lot of men's clothing lines. Actually, it was a textile area in North Carolina. The mill shut down, they went overseas. They've got a textile research facility now called the Manufacturing Solutions Testing Center. And Mexico realized that they've got assets in Hidalgo, big textile industry, but they didn't have the right ingredients to merge that with the research that North Carolina did. North Carolina said, yeah, we'll help you out. We're going to lend you the expertise to for your startups for textiles. In return, Conover goes, let's partner research-wise for high revenue. Just last month, they had a new threadline debut at the Milan Fashion Show. Joint patented U.S. and Mexico, Hidalgo Tech de Monterey, and Conroe, North Carolina, because they're shooting for new revenue. And now that will lead to other ways to infuse things. So I'll leave you with 5 quick points here. To build a great cupcake, you first have to get the right ingredients, but you first have to find the coalition of the willing to form a coalition of the winning. You need to have the right people at the table, and you win with small bits, small wins. First thing is you want to invite to the table, incentivize all stakeholders to form this coalition. And the number one thing is diversity is in strength of the ecosystem. Get everybody to the table. If the church in that community is the largest, then get them to the table because they may have an asset, an ingredient that helps expand that piece. Go deeper than what you normally what you think about when you turn to your ecosystem. It's not just universities. It could be your K-5 education system. Greenville, South Carolina now has an elementary engineering school. That's their workforce component, elementary engineers. So go deeper than what you traditionally think about. Expand the capacity to other regions that may share your assets based on the cluster map for others. So Brownsville, Montemoros, for instance, has got SpaceX about 35 miles away. They could be working with Cape Canaveral, Florida. Expand that zone, expand that reach. Link up projects and partners across all levels of government, universities, philanthropies, anybody you can think about, and find that quick win because you can build that fast. And finally, speed is key. Speed is key because government needs to get out of the way in certain areas, or private sector needs to get out of the way in certain areas to speed up or eliminate and remove friction. Whether it's permitting or patenting or whatever, find ways to streamline that so that these people, that coalition can move quickly. And the thing is, as part of that, you're going to fail at some point. If you do fail, learn, re-engineer, and move forward based on what you've learned from that things. Google said they fail 99 times every time they win. So learn to fail because you may learn the idea. And finally, look the long term. A lot of times we look 5 years out. If we don't look beyond 5, 10, 15, 20 years out, we're going to miss the boat. So here, looking 20 years out, what sectors, what capacities, what cupcakes will taste like in 20 years is what you want to look for. And hopefully, I think there's some, I did see some brownies that just moved over there. So, and
Does
cupcakes.
it apply to brownies as well?
It does apply to brownies and other things.
Okay.
So
Melissa, would you say that that the Cali Baja region has the ingredients to make its cupcake with its current tools? Does it need to import ingredients from somewhere else?
So, I mean, I think to the point and extending the cooking metaphor a bit, certainly international trade creates very idiosyncratic specializations, and that's something that we see in Cali Baja. So we have Southern California biotech, we have military in San Diego, and as a result of that, you see a medical device manufacturing cluster, you see an aerospace manufacturing cluster. And so, you know, perhaps if you're going to have a picnic, you might go to the store and buy a potato salad because Vaughn's does that really well, but you make the sandwiches to take with you. And other people maybe have different specializations, right? And so I think what happens when you have regions that grow these really dynamic trade relationships is that each one gets to decide if they're making the frosting or if they're making the sprinkles and leverage the things that they have in their community. But to that point, you can develop new specializations as well. So I think, you know, perhaps the private sector is really good at figuring out what some of those specializations currently look like, where government can step in, where universities can step in, where the public sector and economic development practitioners can step in, is to find and build new areas of specialization that maybe the private sector can't always do on its own.
And perhaps we may attempt to bake a cupcake and we have our own failures because of certain environment characteristics that it just didn't work. It didn't work out, right? And then we learn from that, I think. Would you say that that's? have we seen that?
So, I mean, I also think that lots of economic growth can come out of those failures as well. So, if you try to build an industry and that industry doesn't work, you still build new supply chain capacity. You still build new economic specializations that can be applied in a different direction.
Let me piggyback on that. When you look at what you're trying to grow or linking up two different ecosystems or two different things together, you look for what's called a growth delta. Where is the optimizational growth within the industry sector or whatever that product line is? Now, your long-term product line or your long-term growth may be separate for where your revenue stream is. So a good example, I'll use Brownsville again. You've got SpaceX around the corner. They're doing ceramic research for jet engines. Everybody knows that. And so when you look at that long-term growth, that's going to be a 5, 15, 20-year product line to figure out when did this hit finally to the optimization rate for your return on investment for that ceramic and the jet engine. However, if you've ever been shopping now, you know about ceramics and pots and pans. So you look at secondary sectors or third sectors that are part of that primary sector that you're looking for long-term to create revenue streams within that, so it allows you to fund that primary long-term sector. So it could be, a good example, NASA had spray foam insulation. The revenue stream for spray foam insulation was not being used in the shuttle, it's actually being used in homes. So you're able to look at that long-term product line and find revenue streams that allow you to fund with others. So if you do fail, you've got other ways to catch it and put revenue into others that still maintain the system or grow in those industry sectors or whatever based on that long-term and short-term goals.
And you're saying that from the perspective of the private sector?
You can do private sector or government, either one.
Because that's what I was wondering, and Melissa, as you were talking about the decisions that we make, are they conscious? Are we doing it, and are we communicating, we, the private sector, with the government officials, so appointed, elected, otherwise? Whoever wants to.
I think the public sector, like you said, they don't create jobs, but they create the foundation for it. And part of it is being aware of those limitations and being aware of what your shortfalls are. And I think in our area, we're becoming aware. Oh, I'm sorry. In our area, I think the awareness is now becoming evident and increasing that we need to work as a whole region and that we can't be working independently of each other. And I think that is a first step. And because of that, we know what the shortfalls are, so it's clear what the path forward is. Education and workforce training is our biggest challenge. Infrastructure, we got great transportation infrastructure, I think in large part to the VTA and the work they've done, but that's not sufficient. We need to work on power, and we need to work on water, all the competitive elements. But I would say workforce development, the water and the power side, and then the capital availability. That's a serious problem. We're attracting foreign firms from Italy, for example, in the case of Brownsville, and they don't have the capital availability or the credits to be able to build and invest. And so credit enhancements, I think Mexican investors that want to come and invest in the United States, people that are primarily producing in Mexico to the United States, may have a competitive advantage to move to the border. But yet, it's hard for big banks to bank them because of all the security regulations. So I think the path is clear for us. We're much farther behind. You look at per capita incomes. But I think it started with the awareness that we all need to work together. And there's growing consensus that Matamoros, McAllen, Reynosa need to work together. So I think it's clear what we need to do, but it's different for everyone.
So what we do in Brownsville, Matamoros is, well, first of all, the government's there to try to get the right people to the right table through the comprehensive economic strategy model, whether it's EDA funded or other funded groups, these regional plans that we act as the glue to get the right people to the table. The second thing that we've been trying to do is fund what's called transaction cost mitigation items, whether it's infrastructure or roads or bridges or research universities, whatever it is. We try to decrease the friction in that private sector so the private sector can take off. And whether it's long-term research is a good example that we can fund that, or that actually the strategy you talked about earlier today, that's an EDA project.
Right, exactly.
So it's there to get the right people to the right table. At the end of the time, the keys must be turned over to the private sector. So we fund that transaction cost mitigation. And then eventually, let's turn the keys over. Let's keep the patents in the private sector. Let's get everything there in the private sector. But our job is to give them a little bit of a push.
And one of I think the greatest challenges, though, is being nimble and adapting to the changing environment and changing needs of economic development, and that is an obstacle. Not not just the government, but, you know, the private sector too, to be able to respond and change policies or be nimble to support it. And I think that is, you know, as much as we can frame that,
Right.
that is a reoccurring challenge, I think.
I would add that I'm really glad that we're talking about workforce development and linking that to this issue of trade, because perhaps the biggest mistake that we're making in the U.S. right now is thinking about the U.S.-Mexico economic relationship as a win-lose type of relationship. You know, I think we see for sure in San Diego and Tijuana and probably all along the border that in fact, our companies grow together, and many times companies are making decisions and they're thinking about other places in the world to locate and expand if they see too much friction between the two countries at the border. And if we can focus on workforce development more, it makes the stronger argument for companies to grow and expand, not in Mexico or in the US, but in both places together.
In talking about workforce development and some of the obstacles that we face because of the access to that workforce, the dual certification, immigration, visas, and so forth. Something interesting that's being proposed in our region is because one of the advantages you can take of for a border region is perhaps locating office space or facility on the other side of the border. So a company, say Qualcomm, who already has identified someone that they want to hire, but you know, it's costly to get the visa or there's no more visas available. They don't need to obtain one. They can just have an office right there that's shared perhaps by 20 other companies and house the talent there, which is, you know, interesting, innovative ways of accessing that workforce, given our limitations. While we work on improving those policies, we could take advantage, perhaps, of our strategic location. Who knows what other ideas we can think of. Along those lines, technology is something that we've talked about throughout the day today, and changing environment because of technology. What role does technology play in economic development?
That's a key element, obviously. It's a key element, obviously. One of the programs that we're proposing along the South Texas border is an integrated workforce training integrated with technology. So you start kids from high school with manufacturing, and they can leave from there, get a certification to go to work, or they can keep going to the next level, which would be at the technical college level where they're engineering technologists. They can go work immediately after that, or they go to the next level up where they get actually an engineering degree and go work after that, or they can get a PhD, and that's where the technology comes in. As you were suggesting, it's a way to reduce the friction, subsidize, instead of having to go out and hire a whole R&D investment group. They can get subsidized through, say, the local universities by having that. So I think workforce development is tied into technology. It provides innovation, entrepreneurship elements as well. So it's very critical. Yeah.
Perhaps an entire sector, right?
Oh, completely, yeah.
So I'm going to say something very controversial here, and please.
Let's pause.
Yeah.
And we're going to go to questions from the audience here, so start warming up the questions. All right.
If you really pull back the layers on workforce, a lot of times people say they want a trained workforce, but when you really ask companies further and further and peel back those layers of the onions, they don't want a trained workforce. They want a trainable workforce. There's a difference between the two, because a trained workforce is static. A trainable workforce is dynamic.
Correct.
And the newest models that I've seen is the trained workforce is actually shifting back to the K-5 model. So let me tell a quick story about what I see the new workforce is. Conover, North Carolina's got more engineers per population than anywhere. Greenville, South Carolina has got more engineers per population than anywhere else in the United States. It's where BMW is there, Volvo North America, Michelin, holding our R&D facilities with Clemson are all there. It's about 8,700 engineers in Greenville, South Carolina. Now one place if you always look at top 5 communities, it's always Greenville's up there. They said, our workforce, we do traditional community college, university stuff all the time. We're going to shift this a little bit. We're going to put an elementary engineering school in the worst part of South Carolina, 100% free and reduced lunch. 60% basically have a parent in prison. They do the laundry at their school. All these kids do. 8 performing school nationally, 8 performing school globally. They finish their a middle school engineering program. Their high school is in the works now, and their Clemson is guaranteed 1 year of automatic admittance for anybody graduating that high school. They take their private sector partners and say, kindergartners, when Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall, can we get BMW engineers to put him back together again? That's a public-private partnership for workforce now that's starting at the K through 5 level. Finland is going to that model now. Sweden's going to that model. So when you look at the new workforce, the new economy, it's how do we get these kids to be trainable as opposed to trained in the long term. So.
All right. Lydia, go ahead.
Thank you. Congratulations to all. My name is Lydia Nesbitt. I am with the Borderplex Economic Alliance in El Paso, Texas. Great conversation. I have a question for Mr. Marin, and then a couple questions for Gabriel and Melissa. But Mr. Marin, I am just congratulations on that study that you're doing. But I do want to. I don't think did you mention how you were going to finance talent across international boundary lines, and how this was going to be financed? You're talking about capital. You get into all these issues once we cross border lines. In our area, we have 3 different regions, and we had to separate our talent creation by region because unfortunately capital doesn't, or you know about the Texas Workforce Commission. I mean, we can't fund anything across that border, and yet we are technically connected by the hip, you know, and we've proven that. So, and then the Mexican government sometimes can't really pair up that. And it happens in tourism, it happens in manufacturing, it happens in every place. So that's my first question. How do you foresee that being handled? I think your leadership, your strategy, all of that is in place, and I totally agree with that. It's just the funding issue on our end has been that. And leadership from all 3 areas are also participating. But again, you know, how do you fund? Those leaders come to the table and put some money there. So,
and then your second question.
my second question goes over to Gabriel and Melissa. Do you know of any studies that have come up where you're measuring wealth creation on the Mexican side? Because if we can prove wealth creation on the Mexican side, then I think we have a good point for immigration and talent development and everything. If you know of any studies that do that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, well, in terms of the funding, that's a hard question, and all the hard questions are going to go to Chris Wilson because he's part of the study. No, it's a very important point. Let's address the problem with Texas Workforce Commission. If you look at Brownsville and the kind of jobs they've got, well, it's Border Patrol and it's teachers. So they're going to fund and create training programs for those folks. The first thing is to change their mentality that we have to look, as you were saying, being trainable, and the jobs for being trainable for the future jobs. So that's one of the elements. But public education has traditionally been a public sector function. But there has been already some developments on the private side, on the Mexican side, in terms of R&D, because they understand the importance of R&D for their maquila industry and making it more competitive. So there's already some private. Obviously, it's going to have to be some private sector money. And then I think there's an opportunities if we can make it so that have Mexican citizens on the border can come to Texas and get educated at the universities at the residence tuition, and that's already happening. And I think that's the kind of creative thinking we need to implement in order to come up with the kind of workable, trainable workforce rather.
And then in workplace training.
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, the model that we're proposing is industrial parks where you have the University Manufacturing Innovation Hub located right next to the manufacturing facilities. and you have apprenticeships. As they're being paid and they're walking across the street, they can go to school, they're being trained. Again, all integrated from high school level all the way through the R&D facilities.
And we see that in other models. In Querétaro, they have
Yes, yes.
a Bombardier there, and right next to it is the Aerospace University. And in fact, all of the training is done with their
Right.
equipment, their tools, their machines, the airplanes. They donate it to the university, and it's a funnel for them.
Exactly. That model's already being implemented in the Brownsville area for where the facilities will pay for the equipment. And beautiful examples in South Carolina with the Clemson and BMW centers. Obviously, it's got to be a partnership between the public and the private sectors. The international component gets a little more complicated, but there's some ideas on how to do that as well.
We can
So.
learn.
So there are some studies, economic studies, that look at wealth creation as it relates to NAFTA that find very minimal effects. There's a good one by Caliendo and Parra that shows that. I think, when NAFTA was negotiated, it was envisioned that there would be very substantial wealth creation at the national level in both countries. And that's not what economists see as a result of the trade agreement. What you see is that in particular cities, in particular states, in particular industries, there's a tremendous amount of value creation and wealth creation. And perhaps, but we don't have data that lets us look at that easily. So you have to create very complicated economic models to get under the hood. And maybe we didn't emphasize it enough in our comments, but our model, although we were talking about some of the impacts in San Diego, is a cross-border model that lets us look not at the wealth effects, but at the income effects in Baja California as well. And it's the kind of methodology that can be applied along the border or along the 10 border states to show on an annual basis the amount of value, jobs, income that are created through trade and by particular industries.
Gabriel, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, basically, it's the same with our model. You can look at where most wealth is created. So, in which industries most wealth is created, and thus you can invest more in education and looking at those industries.
Great. Did you want to add?
I was going to piggyback on your first question. The question that I have back
Funding. You're going to offer funding.
to you. Well,
Did I get that right?
the El Paso Medical Campus is actually one of ours. The question is, why would you want to move money across the border? And the reason why I say that is, if there's a friction that you can't move it across the border, can you use other ways, technical assistance, research, or whatever, to link together to form a third stream of money, like a revenue stream using a patent line or whatever, to come back to fund across the border? Does everybody understand what I kind of said? So if you got money from El Paso and whatever, research capacity, UT El Paso, I use it. And I use Tecno Monterey. If you can't get money from UT El Paso, Tecno Monterey, you may have two lines from both groups that could come together on a research piece to form a technology or whatever, and use that revenue stream from that technology to come back and fund across both ways. So you look for new revenue pathways. If there's friction in one revenue pathway, find a third pathway to fund it back into it. Like I said, Google high margins.
Okay. All right. One more question. Last question of the day. Ramiro, go ahead.
Barry, that recipe made me hungry too that you were talking about, and
Ramiro,
those cupcakes.
We
I'm
know
with
you,
the
but
San
can you
Antonio
introduce-
Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I'm the president CEO.
Yeah,
Good to see you again. Thanks for coming
Yeah.
to see us a month ago. Are those gluten-free cupcakes or?
They're calorie-free, according to my wife. She faced my college football photo to everybody the other day. It's pretty bad. But I think one thing you want to look at was San Antonio. And I can't thank you guys enough for hosting the America's Competitive Exchange last month. You guys did a phenomenal job. We're tracking.
Thank you.
So those that don't know, real quickly, is there's a new program that the U.S. government is running called the America's Competitive Exchange on Innovation Entrepreneurship, where we take the economic assets of your area and we bring 50 of the most powerful people in the world to cut the economic deal. undersecretaries of country, ministers of country, whatever it is, in the hemisphere mostly, a venture capital director of Mexico from INADEM, Leilon Reyes, and San Antonio or a group has a date for one day to open up their assets. And then we move on to the next group or whatever. We're tracking, I don't know if you heard this, but we're tracking 850 penetration possible partnerships out of ACE7 that San Antonio and Austin, San Marcos just hosted in April. ACE8 will be in Central Florida, North Central Florida. The application will be coming out the Organization of American States website in July. 50 people max, secured U.S. government charter bus. North Central Florida, opening up NASA for 4 hours at the administrative level, University of Florida, and to move the economic needles to joint research, new partnerships, new whatever, across the way. So it's trying to create those bigger recipes, bigger linkage points to create revenue streams so they can fund across the board, they can fund other things. And before you all leave today, since I know we're last speakers, wouldn't it be interesting to just say, hello, my name is? It's, hello, my name is so-and-so, I have this asset. What asset do you have with your firm or connection piece? How can we work together to form another asset between our two groups so we all can create better cupcakes in the end? So.
Well, with that, being a San Diego girl, I'd like to close with a quote from Mr. Padre Tony Gwynn, who's a huge asset for our region, and I would say nationally. He said, I'm a chemistry guy, and for us to win, we all have to play together. Whether we're chemists or cooks, I think that is the ultimate, we need to work together, cook together with the ingredients that we have, and if not, go out and find those. And there's a lot of cupcakes out there waiting to be baked. Will you join me in thanking our panelists, please?
Thanks so much, Paula. Thanks so much to our panel here. I want to just thank one more time our sponsors for all their support through today, and once again also thank the BTA for their partnership in this event for our 4th year going, and just introduce to the stage to offer some final comments as we close out the session, Britton Clark, the president of the BTA.
Well done. Definitely an interesting day. Good conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. So on behalf of the Border Trade Alliance, I want to thank this great team here at Woodrow Wilson's Mexico Institute, the Center for Mexico Institute, and for partnering with the BTA for the 4th annual conference. Duncan Wood and Chris, y'all do a great job, and we're happy to have this partnership. I also want to thank Russ Jones, our chairman of the BTA, and then the board members of the BTA for being here today. The great program that we had here today would not have been possible without our sponsors, Warner Enterprises, Ambassador Bridge, Constellation Brands, Manette Jones, Delphi, the Fresh Produce Association of Americas, Pro Mexico also. Thank you all. We all know that the next several months will be critical as our border stakeholders look to make our voices heard in the NAFTA talks. I encourage and I hope that each of you will join the BTA efforts to ensure the next NAFTA recognizes the critical role of our shared borders and acknowledges the unique needs of those areas. Jim Mullen, my colleague with the Border Trade Alliance, and our board members, we look forward to sharing with you the BTA's work to shape a pro-border NAFTA that builds on the success of the past 25 years and positions North America for great success for the next 25 years. Thanks again to all of you for being here, to our sponsors, and to the BTA board members, and to the Wilson Center.